Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a near peerless classic of Gothic horror. It sits alongside Dracula, Frankenstein, Sweeney Todd, and The Picture of Dorian Gray as works that transcend their original forms and are almost defining pillars of the genre itself. Jekyll and Hyde is renowned for its vivid depiction of the duality of humankind, with the noble and good Dr. Jekyll succumbing to the wickedness of his monstrous alter ego. A modern retelling of Plato's famous two horses that we each must wrestle with in order to live our lives. Or is it? Is there more to this novella than a broad strokes morality play that casts all as both victim and villains of our own creation? Could there be something even more discomforting lurking beyond the fog-shrouded lamplight? Could Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde be a story about transing your gender? A couple of notes up top. First up, I'm not going to recap the plot in detail or in order. Go and read it. It's less than 30,000 words. It's barely a novella. Or at least go and see the Red v Blue video on it. It's pretty good. Also, before diving in, I want to clarify what I mean by doing a trans reading of this story. I'm not seeking to suggest that Robert Louis Stevenson was transgender, nor that any gender nonconformity or conflict about gender identity was intentionally in his thoughts when he wrote this story. Instead, literary criticism, at least in the forms we've had since the 20th century, commonly makes use of readings, that is, thinking about a text or other piece of media, through a particular lens. For example, a Marxist reading will pay close attention to the aspects of a story that reflect the relative economic and social power involved. The idea being, firstly, that any author will inevitably reflect various things in their writing, including their own personal biases, and the influences of the surrounding culture. But also, examining text through different lenses can highlight potentially new reflections or expressions of things that can have reached beyond just the context they were originally written in. But also, I would argue that applying scrutiny to this story in particular isn't just an exercise in bourgeois intellectualism for a YouTube channel. It's something that the text itself openly invites. Content notes: institutional/police oppression, suicide, murder, and implied transphobia. The World of Jekyll and Hyde. No, I'm not going to include the full title every time, or this is going to get really long and boring. It's one that is riddled with darkness, vague implications, and secrets, some of which get explored, but many of which are left completely unexamined. Take the first chapter, The Story of the Door. This centres on Richard Enfield telling his friend Utterson, the closest thing we get to an audience surrogate, about his encounter with Hyde. Enfield was, quote, coming home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning. Now, we've all had dates like that. Now, as he walks, he sees a man, Hyde, run into and trample over a young girl. Enfield accosts Hyde, and shortly thereafter the doctor that the girl was sent for appears. And between the doctor and Enfield, they bully Hyde into paying a large sum of money in compensation to the girl's family. In this short section alone, we have so many questions. Why was Enfield on his way home so late? Where had he been? What had he been doing? Why isn't he telling Utterson where he was? Why was a girl being sent for a doctor at 3 a.m? Who needed seeing? Why? Why does the doctor then appear even though the girl being sent for him has been interrupted by Hyde? I'm just asking questions. This does a beautiful job of painting a whole world going on beyond the bounds of the story itself, but also presents the reader right from the outset with an awareness that even if everything they read is true and accurate, there is so much more potentially going on too. By the end of the story, you have at best half a real picture, something that is as tantalizing as it is ultimately bleak and dissatisfying. The only questions that are actively pursued are the ones about this figure. Who is Hyde? And why is he able to produce a check signed by Dr. Jekyll? There is a selective approach at work. For example, the protagonist quickly jumps to the conclusion that Hyde must have some kind of compromat on Jekyll, and Jekyll is being blackmailed into giving Hyde lodging, money, and so forth. But at the same time, one of the first suggestions of what they can do to help is to apply exactly those tactics to Hyde. blackmail him into leaving their friend alone. Indeed, it's precisely the same threat that Enfield and the unnamed doctor use to extort money out of Hyde in the opening chapter. This double standard comes up numerous times elsewhere. Indeed, when Utterson broaches the topic directly with Jekyll, he assumes that Jekyll has done something wrong, and his first thoughts are, quote, "Make a clean breast of this in confidence, and I make no doubt I can get you out of it." This theme is even reflected in the titles of the two characters, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. My point is that this is a story that's values can vary significantly depending on your perspective, and perspective itself is likewise something that the text openly invites the reader to consider. One of the tropes of Gothic fiction was/is the use of certain literary devices to try and increase the reader's suspension of disbelief. Rather than the narrator's story contemporaneously from the protagonist's perspective, writers in the Gothic typically frame their writing in ways that make the reader feel more like they may be reading an account of real events. The most common form of this is the use of documentary storytelling. The Castle of Otranto is the example of this. Considered the first Gothic novel, Otranto is written in the style of a medieval romance, and in early versions of the text its author, Horace Walpole, presented these as if they were a genuine discovered text, and he had acted only as an editor. Another famous example is Dracula, which is written almost entirely in the form of various letters, journal entries, and, high-tech for the time, transcriptions of voice notes one of the characters kept on wax cylinders. In Jekyll and Hyde, Stevenson uses these tools of perspective in two ways. Firstly, the last two chapters of the story are given as documentary, supposedly two handwritten accounts from Dr. Lanyon and then from Jekyll himself. But also, the main events of the story are viewed at the time from third parties. Yes, we hear from Jekyll at the end, but all that can do at that point in the narrative is recontextualize what has gone before. Jekyll himself died 2 chapters earlier, and with them the actual direct action of the plot. There's something genuinely chilling about a story in which someone's words and experiences are only given any kind of space after they're dead. Left almost as footnotes in a case file with no real conclusion and no actual indication about what happens next. It's at best a reflection, something for cool, distant contemplation by those unaffected by the events themselves.
What did we learn, Palmer?
I don't know, sir.
I don't fucking know either. I guess we learned not to do it again.
Yes, sir.
I'm fucked if I know what we did.
The full title of the story, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, immediately sets it up as being both something detached from the reader and also as something of a curiosity. One obvious reading is of the story as a criminal case. After all, the narrative focuses largely on Utterson's amateur detective work, first seeking to meet Mr. Hyde out of curiosity, and then with the intent of bringing the law down on him. However, another interpretation is of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as a scientific or medical curiosity. Is the strange case, in fact, a case study? These questions are important because the framing of the story brings with it certain expectations. A crime story typically adds a presumption of not only wrongdoing, but also malicious intent and repercussions. But seen through the medical lens, it instead becomes a study in pathology, with presumptions of someone being sick, that there is a malady in need of a cure. Seen through a pathologizing lens, Mr. Hyde is an illness of Jekyll's that, by definition almost, needs to be cured. It never considers that Hyde is just as much Jekyll as the Doctor is. Or even that Hyde could be better, happier, more complete than his counterpart. Pathologizing assumes that deviation from the norm is an error in need of correction. Not that deviation could be the cure in and of itself, or simply something that doesn't need curing. The medical community in general has a strong tendency towards pathologizing, sort of the golden hammer problem. When all you do is try to cure sickness, it's easy to see anything you encounter as an illness of some kind. Autism research in particular is a ripe example of this, where neurotypical behavior is seen as the norm and anything else is seen as somehow deficient. For example, one infamous study gave participants a simple, low-stakes moral choice, one where the actions weren't observed. The study found that autistic people, note, I'm not saying people with autism, were statistically more likely to do the honest action rather than the selfish one, compared with neurotypical participants. How did the researchers report this? That autistic people exhibited a deficiency in self-interest. Not that autistic people are more honest than neurotypical people. Homosexuality went through a prolonged period of being considered a mental illness, with the resultant treatments including things like the chemical castration that, for example, killed Alan Turing. Defining something as an illness also puts doctors in a position of immense power. It sets them up as the arbitrators of how someone is perceived, who they deem as valid or not, and what help that person can access. For transgender people, this means that everything from changing your gender mark on your passport through to accessing hormones, blood tests, counselling, surgery, are all entirely at the whim of doctors who maybe want to help, maybe think it's just a phase, maybe are happy to blindly shove people into a system that systematically dehumanizes us as a matter of routine. At the time of writing this essay, I've been waiting more than 6 months for my doctor to write a 2-sentence letter in support of me getting my passport updated. In the meantime, I haven't been able to vote, to travel internationally, or do things like require photographic ID like updating a bank account. When, after months of repeated requests, they finally produced it, they misgendered me in the text message saying the letter was ready. The curious case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde explicitly draws out this distancing effect. Utterson is lifelong friends with both Jekyll and Lanyon. The two had a falling out about a decade before the events of the story. When Utterson brings this up, Lanyon's response is, quote, was somewhat of a relief to Utterson. They've only differed on some point of science, he thought. And being a man of no scientific passions, except in the matter of conveyancing, he even added, it is nothing worse than that. Why are you getting so upset? I'm just stating facts. It's just science. It's just about how big your gametes are. Anyway, speaking of pathologizing, quote, it was a curse of mankind that these incongruous faggots were thus bound together. That in the agonized womb of consciousness, these polar twins should be continuously struggling. How then were they dissociated? Dissociative identity disorder, DID, sometimes referred to as multiple personality disorder, is, well, a big topic, and one I can't really speak to with much authority. As a very crude summary, somebody with DID may experience multiple distinct personality states or alters that, according to the mental health charity Minds website, quote, may have different patterns of thinking and relating to the world, may come across as different ages and genders, and may have memories or experiences that conflict with each other. Ultimately, I have no experience, either lived or professional, with DID, and the practice of diagnosing people from afar, let alone fictional characters from over a century ago, is fraught at best. What's perhaps more relevant is Jekyll and Hyde being an early example of the harmful pop cultural narratives around DID, specifically co-locating dissociative disorders and transgressive behaviour, especially violence, and depicting alters as being in a fundamentally antagonistic relationship. Well, kinda. Let's take a step back for a second. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was first published in 1886. Almost immediately, it was a big success and became prime material for adaptations. The first stage play based on the story, written by Thomas Sullivan, hit theatres in 1887, and a second, adapted by John McKinney and Daniel Bannerman in 1888, actually wound up running in direct competition with Sullivan's. Sullivan's version of the play also famously, and probably not accurately, had to close down amid the general panic around the contemporary Whitechapel murders, which at least one theatregoer convinced themselves that the play's lead, Robert Mansfield, could be the real Jack the Ripper. Now, what these stage adaptations did, in common with most other later adaptations, including countless films, stage productions, TV series, Does anyone else remember Julia Jekyll and Harriet Hyde? Is that the plays started taking some interesting liberties with the original novella. Firstly, they eschewed the book's unconventional non-linear storytelling. The Wikipedia article discussing this argues that it's because a theatrical audience wouldn't need so much suspension of disbelief when they can see a transformation in front of them. Which is fair, but also if you were to adapt the story straight, the entire third act would be Utterson sitting in a chair, reading 2 lengthy letters. Other common changes include significantly de-aging most of the cast to make Jekyll a young, vibrant radical, and most painfully tacking on love interests that ultimately don't really bring anything to the story, save, I guess, to water down any potential queer undertones. Most importantly, however, almost all the adaptations, and certainly all the ones that I have seen, but there is a lot of them, seriously a lot. What almost all the adaptations have in common is that they reduce the interaction of Jekyll and Hyde into one of both complete dissociation and antagonism. Most adaptations depict Jekyll and Hyde as a fight between 2 polarized and conflicting personalities, the completely good Jekyll and the completely evil Hyde. These adaptations also typically whitewash Jekyll's experiments as being well-intentioned but ultimately flawed attempts to make people better through use of medical science. Never seen that idea go bad. Rather than the novella's motivation, which is basically that Jekyll wants to keep doing the immoral stuff he enjoys, but without the guilt. In Jekyll's letter in the last chapter, he states repeatedly that whereas Jekyll is a conflicted composite of a person, torn between socially acceptable dry pursuits and his other urges, Hyde has no such conflict, and is of himself complete. The reason I stress this point is because I think it has the potential to completely shift the interpretation of the story. When viewed as an antagonistic war between good and evil, then Jekyll's friends are trying to help him overcome a deep inner struggle. They are fundamentally on his side, but when Jekyll's transformations are viewed as something he actively seeks out and enjoys, it becomes more a story of him embracing his authentic self, and of how this is not only intolerable to society at large, but also how his friends are trying desperately to intervene, whether wanted or not. In their 2023 paper, Figuring It Out, Confusing Non-Binary Gender in Runaways and the Order of the Stick, Melissa Sharney Brown and Jude Roberts discussed non-binary gender depictions in comics, specifically non-binary characters in the webcomic The Order of the Stick, and in the Marvel comic series Runaways. In particular, they discuss how explicitly non-binary gender depictions in what are literally just drawings nevertheless provoke huge fascination amongst some aspects of their readership who become obsessed with the establishing of a true binary gender for these non-binary characters. Okay, hang on, let me pull up an image from The Order of the Stick. Yeah, on the comics forums there were dozens of lengthy and occasionally heated threads by people convinced that they had figured out the truth about this collection of lines. We live in a very normal world, and people are completely capable of being normal about gender stuff, I absolutely promise. Brown and Roberts describe these depictions of non-binary gender as a confusion that people sometimes displace onto the characters themselves, assuming that the confusing is itself confused. And it's this distinction, the confusing versus the confused, that I would argue lies at the heart of the story of Jekyll and Hyde. Jekyll's friends, throughout the story, are deeply concerned for him and cannot fully comprehend his relationship with Hyde, and so project a presumed conflict onto the pair. Later media adaptations have largely, I can't say exclusively, have you any idea how many different adaptations there are of this story? But have largely taken forward this projection themselves, typically portraying Jekyll and Hyde as not only separate personalities but also as being antagonistic. At least by the end of the story. However, this doesn't really fit with the closing chapter of the book, where Jekyll is finally able to tell their own story. Jekyll creates the legal and social persona of Hyde as a smokescreen, a social construct if you will. But to his mind, it's not really a separate person. It's still Jekyll, but without his usual inhibitions. Jekyll isn't confused. He's genuinely having a fucking great time of it, but he is, to his friends and society at large, confusing. The distinction between confusing and confused also strikes home on a deeply personal level for myself, and I suspect quite a few queer people out there. How many of us have had trusted people, even people close to us, suggest that it was just a phase, or social contagion, or that we shouldn't rush into anything, and suggest that deep down they think we're just confused. Often one of the most heartbreaking things that can happen when coming out is feeling like we're immediately thrust into a debating chamber where it's assumed that we don't know our own minds, that the deep personal truth we just trusted someone with is now a matter for open debate, for doubt, for pathologizing. We confuse them, so they assume that we are confused. And I just want to remind people that this isn't a debate, because this isn't. It's not just some abstract concept. When people say that trans people or queer people don't exist, that has real-world impact, often violently so. Speaking of violence, one of the things that strikes me now, reading back over the strange case, is how many utterly brilliant and memorable lines there are, and how many of them have been rattling around in the back of my brain since the very first time I read this story years and years ago. In particular, there's a point where Utterson is accompanying a police officer to investigate Hyde's pied-à-terre in Soho. The thoughts of his mind, besides, were of the gloomiest dye, and when he glanced at his companion of the drive, he was conscious of some touch of that terror of the law and the law's officers, which may at times assail the most honest. When I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, a piece of legislation was in place, commonly referred to as Section 28, that, amongst other things, made it illegal to promote homosexuality in places like schools. What this meant in effect was that any overt discussion of anything pertaining to queer people was effectively outlawed. I also grew up during a period where in the UK, the age of consent between two consenting men was 18, whereas for heterosexual intercourse, the legal age of consent was 16. Add on to that, the Gender Recognition Act was only passed in 2004, whilst I was at university, and protections against discrimination under the Equality Act only started in 2010. I have grown up in, and lived my adult life in, a world where the legal landscape around queer and trans people has shifted dramatically. Is it any wonder then that so many queer people have, at very best, a complicated relationship with law enforcement? One of the scariest things that happens when one starts to realize their queer identity is that lots of the systems of power, protection, and privilege around you suddenly become much less certain. To come out as queer is to expose yourself to a shifting, untrustworthy system of powers that are horrifyingly frequently controlled, abused, and bluntly played with by politicians to achieve their own ends. I am so looking forward to the 2024 election. Coming out as trans meant potentially painting a target on my back from the perspective of the law and, by extension, those who choose to enforce it. In Jekyll and Hyde, Utterson is a lawyer, and more than that, we're told that, quote, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of downgoing men. What exactly is meant to have been done by these downgoing men is never made clear. In fact, one of the biggest unknowns of the entire story is what almost any of the immoral, scandalous deeds Hyde is supposed to have done actually are. But it's clear enough from this description that whatever it is enough for them to, in addition to whatever legal punishment they face, also see near total social ostracizing. As an aside, I actually kind of love the implication that Utterson being the last good influence quietly condemns the legal system. Like, you're not going to achieve anything positive with whatever you're planning on doing. One possible interpretation is that Utterson could regularly be defending men being persecuted for homosexuality. For context, The story was published in 1886, very shortly after the passing of the Labouchere Amendment, a piece of legislation which made it much easier to prosecute gay men, and which less than a decade later would be used to convict Oscar Wilde. Writing in Crime Reads, author Jill Dearman highlights just how proximate this legislation was to the writing of Jekyll and Hyde. Quote, "The actual date of the law's passage, August 14, 1885, according to Stevenson's biographer Frank McLean, most of the writing on Jekyll and Hyde was done in September and October of 1885. The novella's publication date was January 5, 1886. Could this have played into the extreme urgency with which Stevenson felt driven to write the story? You do the math. So for Utterson, as a frequent confidant of people being prosecuted for being queer, interacting with the police could absolutely be an unsettling experience. Bluntly, the story actually lends itself rather well to reading Utterson as gay. He has no wife or children, he keeps seemingly exclusively male company. Although how much of that is intentional is perhaps tricky to say, but Jekyll and Hyde is, even by the standards of the time, kind of extreme in its utter lack of female characters. Homosexual? Certainly. Homosexual? Perhaps. One of the confounding factors when considering this is it would have absolutely been illegal for Stevenson to publish a story with explicit queer characters as the protagonists. Still, there's a few bits of phrasing here and there, like the way Stevenson describes how at a dinner party, quote, "Mr. Utterson so contrived that he remained behind after the others had departed. This was no new arrangement, but a thing that had befallen many scores of times. But Utterson was liked, he was liked well. Hosts loved to detain the dry lawyer, when the light-hearted and the loose-tongued had already their foot on the threshold. They create these elaborate rituals to be in the private company of other men." When viewing the strange case not from the perspective of Utterson but from Jekyll, the whole tension of the piece shifts. It's no longer a story of a mysterious backdoor dealings of blackmail and conflict. Instead it becomes something subtler, more intimate, and ultimately far more heartbreaking. Through this lens, the real story of Jekyll and Hyde is of Jekyll finding a path to self-fulfillment and happiness, and his closest friends unwittingly setting about destroying this escape that he has achieved. And in many ways, the inciting incident, the thing that draws so much unwanted and persistent attention to Hyde, isn't the late-night hit and run, but rather the writing of a will. Jekyll's will is pretty straightforward, really. It leaves everything to Hyde, but includes the rather alarming provision that this occurs following either his death or mysterious disappearance. Obviously, this attracts much concern from Utterson, but from Jekyll's perspective, it's the only sensible thing he can do to try and put together some form of legal protection for himself as Hyde. Because the law, as it stood, just wasn't set up to recognize the possibility of someone becoming someone else. And it still isn't. From a more general queer reading, this echoes what many queer people have done through the years to try and stitch some kind of threadbare legal web for their loved ones. Things like gay couples having one of them legally adopt the other. People trying desperately to scrape together protections that would go without saying for cis straight couples. Oh yeah, I suppose we probably ought to talk about the murder.
We're just normal men.
What do you mean, normal men?
We're just innocent men.
One of the things I love about this story, and arguably part of why it has aged so well, is that Stevenson gives very few specifics, especially around the story's more dramatic points. Crucially, we're almost never told about anything bad that Hyde has actually done. We can, with a little detective work, make a few assumptions, mostly that what he's doing is shocking and transgressive to contemporary sensibilities, but not enough to directly involve the police, say. Much of his past was unearthed. Indeed, and all disreputable, tales came out of the man's cruelty, at once so callous and violent, of his vile life, of his strange associates, of the hatred that seemed to have surrounded his career, but of his present whereabouts not a whisper. The two exceptions are the aforementioned trampling of a young girl and brutal beating to death of an MP, Or at least I think he's an MP. The original text seems pretty vague on this, but all the stuff discussing it seems sure he's an MP, so, fine. The murder is notable in that there is only one witness, a servant who sees the scene from an upstairs window. She describes two figures, one she recognises as Hyde, and the other she at length describes as almost angelic, who stops Hyde, and after a brief conversation, Hyde violently attacks the man. There's a couple of important aspects to this story. Not least is that throughout the encounter we're given nothing of the actual dialogue between Hyde and Carew. One of the other more important factors is that by her own admission, the servant is fucking asleep at the time of the murder. All of which is to say that the account we get of the murder is pretty vague and largely based on the servant's impressions, which are, well, after spending several lines describing the innocent and old-world kindness of disposition, she describes the assault as being with ape-like fury, which is a bit of a loaded turn of phrase. In particular, though, the servant's testimony reflects something that occurs time and again throughout the story. Everybody, for some reason they can't quite put their fingers on, takes an instant dislike to Edward Hyde. The closest we get to any description of this is vague impressions of some kind of deformity or asymmetry. But nobody ever gives anything too specific. Hyde is just universally but somehow inexpressibly other. My dude is cocky. There's a part of the story close to the beginning where Utterson sets out to meet Hyde face to face. Utterson approaches him as he's entering the back door of Jekyll's house, and as the conversation unfolds, Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. "Mr. Hyde, I think." Mr. Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of the breath, but his fear was only momentary. Though he did not look the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly enough, "That is my name. What do you want?" "Will you let me see your face?" asked the lawyer. Mr. Hyde appeared to hesitate, and then, as if upon some sudden reflection, fronted about with an air of defiance, and the pair stared at each other pretty fixedly for a few seconds. "Now I shall know you again," said Mr. Utterson. "It may be useful." There's something about these interactions, the hesitation, the air of menace from Utterson that feels deeply uncomfortably familiar. How many times has an unexpected interaction made me suddenly unsure of myself, of my voice, of my appearance? How many times have trivial interactions raised fears of verbal or physical violence? Rereading the story, one of the things that leaps out at me time after time is how all of the encounters with Hyde are described from others' perspectives. And a part of me wonders how much these depictions of people taking an instant visceral yet inexplicable dislike to someone, ganging together against them, leveraging their privilege, how much would these accounts differ from someone describing a hate crime, but from a perpetrator's perspective? It can be hard to corroborate this particular theory because, ultimately, we are only ever given one side of events. Deep down, one of the tragic aspects of this story for me is that we never get to hear from Hyde's perspective. Even in the closing of the narrative where Jekyll supposedly lays out the case in full, we never hear from Hyde. And it's worth clarifying that these two would probably have different perspectives, given that one of the things Jekyll writes about is how Hyde, quote, "Scrawling in my own hand blasphemies on the pages of my books, burning the letters and destroying the portrait of my father. If my narrative has hitherto escaped destruction, it has been by a combination of great prudence and great good luck. Should the throes of change take me in the act of writing it, Hyde will tear it in pieces." Hyde never writes an account, or at least not one presented in the story. Instead, the closest thing we get is Jekyll's recounting of events, including the murder, and though he admits to doing it, we're again left with the problem of unreliable narration. In this part, Jekyll writes as if he and Hyde are separate entities, although it muddies back and forth on this, and it's unclear whether the version of events in this last chapter is what happened, what Jekyll believes happened, what Jekyll wants the reader to believe happened, or some ghastly combination of the three? Was Jekyll part of the murder or just a witness? Were the events that led to violence really, quote, no more reasonable spirit than that in which a sick child may break a plaything? I'm just saying, maybe the fucker had it coming.
Down.
Jekyll and Hyde is probably my favourite book. You might have picked up on this, but when I reread it now, I'm not so much following the beats of the mystery or the little descriptive touches that make it such an interesting time capsule. Side note, oh my god, how fragile were keys back in the day? But instead, the depictions of friendship and intimacy among older people. One of the most heartbreaking lines is when Utterson says to Lanyon, quote, "We are three very old friends, Lanyon. We shall not live to make others." That line, more than anything else, really sticks with me. And it's what, for me, really heightens the story to one of tragedy. Not because of Jekyll toying with something he can't control, but because he can't trust his friends. All of Utterson's concerns that drive him to start investigating Hyde would have been moot if he had realised from the outset that Hyde wasn't some kind of villain blackmailing his friend, but his friend in a new form. It's his well-meaning friends trying to protect him that makes things so difficult for Jekyll. Worse, ultimately, when circumstances force him to come out to Lanyon, he's rejected so thoroughly that Lanyon fulfills the promise of every queer person's grandmother and promptly dies of shock. The climax sees Hyde trapped in a literal cabinet, with Utterson breaking down the door. It presents us with a scene in which these two old friends are at an impasse where Jekyll cannot let Utterson in, because they won't let Hyde out. I was going to write a conclusion here, but I don't feel like I can sum up this book in like a neat little single paragraph. So instead, I'm just going to throw out there two particular paragraphs that just feel incredibly relevant to me from a transgender egg perspective. Quote, "Enough then that I not only recognise my natural body from the mere aura and effulgence of certain of the powers that made up my spirit, but managed to compound a drug by which these powers should be dethroned from their supremacy, and a second form and countenance substituted, no less natural to me, because they were the expressions and bore the stamp of lower elements in my soul." Quote, "I came to myself as if out of a great sickness. There was something strange in my sensations, something indescribably new, and from its very novelty, incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in body. Within, I was conscious of a heady recklessness, a current of disordered sensual images running like a mill race in my fancy, a solution of the bonds of obligation and unknown, but not an innocent, freedom of the soul." And I think we'll leave it there. Just wrapping up to say, if you enjoyed this, please do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. If you hit the bell, you'll get notifications when I post new things. If you really, really super like my stuff, I do have a Patreon. I'm patreon.com/Charlotte with a D. There'll be a link in the show notes. Bonus content I'm going to be releasing on Patreon to go alongside this episode is going to be a full audio reading of the story. And I'm also going to do an alternate take of this where I literally just sit here and enthusiastically info dump and see how long that takes and how that varies from the scripted version. Alright, I think that'll do. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.
Who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. Gay, 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 gay.